He has been called one of the greatest cave adventure writers of all times. He's written several books. The latest is The Grand, Gloomy, and Peculiar, the Stephen Bishop story at Mammoth Cave. And we're joined by Roger Brucker, who has written these books and who is so adamant about the preservation of, regarding with respect of caves, that his entire foreword, his author's notes, which usually says, thank you to my wife for putting up with me for all that, this says, be respectful, be mindful, and love what he loves, the Mammoth Cave, and this book written so beautifully. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
A lifelong love of caves.
Well, it started at a very early age when I found out you could put blankets over card tables, tip chairs up, and make your own cave, crawl behind the sofa, and that was really the start of my interest in those things.
Seriously?
Then at age 5, I went to Put-in-Bay in Lake Erie, and I remember being in short pants, and the cave seemed very cold, and they kept rushing me through, and I didn't get to look under things and go into the dark places. At age 8, I was taken to Mammoth Cave, and of course my mother was fearful about that and said, well, we'll just take a little short trip. And I said, no, we want to go on the all-day trip.
Yeah, that was a hike back then.
Oh, she thought so too. We carried lanterns, and I asked a guide one time, where does that passage go? And he said, stopped the whole party and said, little boy wants to know where the passage goes. It doesn't go anywhere, it stays right here. And I thought to myself, that's an outrageous answer, and one day I'm going to find out where that passage goes.
So you have made a career out of loving, exploring, and writing about caves.
Certainly an obsession, yes.
And your lifelong avocation. You made a living doing this.
No, not really. I was originally making films for the Air Force, and then in the business-to-business advertising business, but I've always been interested in caves and have taught speleology to students for 25 years. And I've also taught marketing at Wright State University.
I never saw that term, Pat, before I read his biography, speleology.
Yeah, I knew that because being in Kentucky and a former journalist, everybody knows the story of Floyd Collins.
Yes.
So Roger, before we get into your book, talk about, because you also did some writing about Floyd Collins, didn't you?
Yes, Bob Murray and I wrote a book called Trapped, the story of Floyd Collins. And Floyd Collins was an experienced cave explorer who had encountered success in finding a very large and beautiful cave. His family tried to develop that cave and make money from it, but it was on the end of the tourist line. That is, you had to go past several other caves to get there, including Mammoth Cave, and so the cave languished. And Floyd Collins, who had hoped that that would be a moneymaker, saw that if you went up the road toward where the tourists came in and found a cave, then you could make money. So that's what he was trying to do in 1925, was to find a cave that could be developed and strain off the tourists going to Mammoth Cave. So he crept into this cave after several weeks of trying to enlarge the passageway. He set off a dynamite blast and came back several days later, crawled in there, and on the way out he encountered a rock which trapped his left ankle in a V-shaped groove. He was stuck there because while people knew where he was, they were used to his being in the cave a long time. So it wasn't until the following morning that they began to look for him and found that he was trapped in what amounts to a stone wastebasket. They could reach him with great difficulty, talk to him and feed him a little, but they couldn't get to this rock because the stone surrounded the whole thing. So this story took place at a time when there was what's called a news vacuum.
Yeah.
Hardly anything was going on in the country. And the story spread like wildfire of the efforts to free Floyd Collins.
Sure.
One exciting event after another, they were going to try to pull him out with a rope. And suddenly he screamed so loudly that they stopped. And they were going to use a jack to try to jack up this rock at some long distance. That failed, and then the roof fell in between the would-be rescuers and Floyd Collins. This story dragged out for a little more than 2 weeks, and finally he was discovered dead.
Yeah, and it was the O.J. trial and the JonBenet story of its day. Like
sure.
you said, it was. We studied it in journalism. The Courier Journal was reporting on it every day, and people around the country and around the world were picking up the papers every day to see what happened to Floyd Collins.
Jeez, oh Pete, there's nothing like a real story.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what this book is based on. A real story, Stephen Bishop. His story taking place in the 1800s, and it's something that I'm wondering how you came upon and what made you want to write this book.
I've written 4 nonfiction books about cave exploring in Kentucky. That includes the book Trapped about Floyd Collins, but mainly the contemporary exploration. But I kept coming across Stephen Bishop, and in fact I had written a historical sketch of him in another book. Stephen Bishop was a slave. As a 17-year-old, he was brought to Mammoth Cave by his owner and taught some of the routes in the cave. And in the course of this, he became very curious about the crawlways that went places that apparently nobody had gone before. So from a cave about 8 miles long, he found about 20 more miles of this cave through this adventuring spirit. Well, since there weren't a lot of facts about him, the problem was, how do you write about this man, his passion and obsession, which I understood because I've been doing this for years. How can you write a nonfiction book about that? And the answer was I couldn't. So then I realized that this would have to be a historical novel. And for many years, the problem was not so much trying to figure out where he went, because we knew that, but try to figure out how to tell the story. To me, as a writer, that had to be told in first person. So you can imagine that nobody would want to read a book that started off, "Let me tell you how I became the most famous cave explorer."
Why don't we save the punchline for the other side of commercial, and you can let us know who told the story and why you chose that person to tell his story when we return to today's Northern Kentucky Magazine right here on ICN 6.